Vampire King's son was crying at dinner, until a waitress whispered he needs a mommy. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The atmosphere in the grand dining hall was unlike anything anyone had ever witnessed. The Vampire King, seated at the head of the table, exuded an icy aura, his presence dominating the entire room. The opulent chandeliers cast a cold, golden glow across the marble floors, while the guests, vampires and high society elites, mingled in hushed voices, aware that nothing was ever truly ordinary in the presence of such power. But among the glitz and glamour, there was one detail that no one could ignore: the Vampire King's son. At the far end of the table, his young son sat, his delicate features pale in the dim light, eyes brimming with tears. He couldn't have been older than 7 or 8, but the sorrow in his eyes was far too heavy for someone so young. His tiny hands gripped the edge of the table, his small shoulders shaking as quiet sobs echoed through the room. Yet, despite the tension and whispers, no one moved to comfort him. The adults in the room, powerful vampires and high-ranking officials, pretended not to notice the boy's distress, too cautious to involve themselves with the Vampire King's son. And so, the silence hung heavily in the air, punctuated only by the soft clinking of silverware against fine china. Enter the waitress. A simple woman with no wealth or noble blood, but whose heart had been touched by the sight of the boy's tears. She had been serving the guests, moving gracefully between the tables, her mind focused solely on her duties. But when she passed by the Vampire King's table and noticed the boy, something in her shifted. The child's sorrow was palpable, and she couldn't just ignore it. She had no idea who he was, but that didn't matter. He was a child in pain. As she moved closer, her eyes met the Vampire King's for a brief, tense moment. The intensity of his gaze was enough to freeze anyone in their tracks, but she held her ground. She approached the boy with cautious steps, her heart pounding in her chest. The room seemed to hold its breath as she knelt down beside him. The boy's sobs quieted for a moment, and he looked up at her with tear-streaked cheeks. Without a word, she whispered softly, her voice barely above a murmur, "You need a mommy, don't you?" The boy's eyes widened, a flicker of hope replacing the sadness. The words seemed to resonate with him, like a balm to his aching heart. In that brief moment, something shifted in the Vampire King's cold demeanor. His gaze, which had been fixed on the scene with sharp intensity, softened ever so slightly. The powerful king, who had ruled with an iron fist for centuries, felt a tug in his heart. The waitress had done something no one else dared. She had dared to speak to the child as if he were just that, a child. The room, once filled with whispers and cold tension, now stood in a stunned silence. Even the vampires, creatures of immense power and control, seemed caught off guard. For the first time in decades, the Vampire King's son was not just a royal heir or an object of power. He was a child in need of love and comfort. And in that fleeting moment, the waitress had given him that comfort. What would happen next? Would the Vampire King be moved by this simple act of kindness, or would he punish her for crossing the invisible line that divided their worlds? Only time would tell, but for now, the boy had found a glimmer of hope in the most unexpected place, through the whisper of a stranger who had dared to speak to him as a child. The moment the waitress whispered those words, the tension in the room seemed to shift. The Vampire King's eyes narrowed, his sharp gaze never leaving the scene. No one moved, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, the room became a silent witness to a fragile connection between a child and an ordinary woman. The boy's crying subsided, replaced by the faintest trace of hope in his eyes. The rest of the guests continued to watch in stunned silence, unsure of how to react. The Vampire King remained seated, but something was different now. His expression, once cold and unreadable, softened for the briefest of moments. His son's pain had always been his own burden to bear, but seeing the boy so vulnerable, so unprotected in this moment, made something shift within him. He had never been the type to show emotion. His reign was built on power, on control. Vulnerability had no place in his world. But there, in front of him, was his son, his flesh and blood, finally responding to something he had never been offered before: genuine kindness. The boy's sobs had almost stopped entirely, his small frame still trembling but no longer shaking with the intensity it once had. The waitress, unaware of the significance of her action, remained knelt beside the boy, her eyes soft and filled with empathy. She did not understand the weight of the situation or the power dynamics at play. All she saw was a child in need, and that was enough for her to act. Her heart had simply gone out to him, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. But for the Vampire King, everything changed. His mind raced, his centuries of control battling with a new, unfamiliar emotion. He watched the boy closely, studying his expression as if trying to understand the shift that had just occurred. His son, the heir to his throne, the child he had guarded from the world, had found comfort not from his father but from a stranger, a simple human woman. The idea unsettled him more than he cared to admit. As the minutes passed, the quiet became unbearable. The guests shifted nervously in their seats, unsure whether to speak or remain silent, unsure of how their king would react to this breach of formality. The Vampire King's gaze did not leave the waitress. His son had stopped crying, but his eyes were still wide with wonder, still filled with the need for affection. The waitress gently brushed a tear from his cheek, speaking softly, "It's okay. You're not alone." Those words were enough. The room collectively held its breath, waiting for the Vampire King to speak, to give any indication of how this would be handled. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the Vampire King stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and calm, masking the storm of emotions swirling within him. His voice broke the stillness, cold and commanding. "Leave us." The guests, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, immediately began to rise, filing out of the room without a word. The vampire nobles, so accustomed to holding their composure, now avoided eye contact, scurrying away like frightened children. The Vampire King's son, still in the arms of the waitress, looked up at his father with a mixture of fear and longing. But the Vampire King's expression was unreadable as he turned his gaze back to the woman. The waitstaff, too, seemed to sense the change. The room cleared, leaving only the three of them. The Vampire King approached his son and the woman, the weight of his presence filling the space. He did not speak immediately, only observing. Then, in a voice low but clear, he said, "You've done something no one else dared to do." The waitress felt the weight of his words, but did not flinch. She didn't know exactly what she had done, but she felt the tension in the air. She nodded slightly, unsure of what to say. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. He was just crying, and I thought, maybe he needed someone." The Vampire King studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "You are more than just a servant, aren't you?" His words were like a challenge, something deeper than mere observation. The waitress swallowed hard, feeling the intensity of his stare. She had no idea what he was implying, but she wasn't about to back down. "I'm just a woman, doing my job." The words were simple, but they carried a weight of their own. The Vampire King stepped closer, his gaze never leaving her face. "You're more than that. You've shown compassion where none existed. My son will remember this moment, and so will I." The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. The boy, still in the waitress's arms, clung to her, his tiny hands gripping her sleeve. The Vampire King turned his attention to his son. His voice softened, a rare and unexpected shift. "You found comfort where I could not give it. Perhaps it is time I reconsidered how I rule, how I protect." There was a pause before he looked back at the waitress. "You will stay here tonight. My son needs you." The words were in order, but they felt more like a question. The waitress didn't know what to say. Her mind was spinning. I don't understand. Why me?" The Vampire King's gaze softened, though only slightly. "Because you are the only one who saw him for who he truly is. And that is something no one else has done." The room was quiet, the weight of his words settling in the air like a storm cloud. The waitress, still holding the boy, could feel the gravity of the situation. Her life had just shifted on its axis, and there was no turning back. The night stretched on, thick with tension and anticipation. The Vampire King's son, still nestled in the arms of the waitress, clung to her as if she were the only thing anchoring him to the world. The Vampire King stood in the background, watching his son, his sharp gaze never leaving the woman who had dared to show such compassion. His thoughts were a whirlwind, torn between the centuries-old rules of his reign and the unexpected stirrings of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in centuries. The castle had grown eerily quiet. The distant sounds of the wind howling outside were the only noise that dared to break the stillness. The vampire king finally moved, his footsteps echoing like thunder in the vast room. He approached the pair, his dark eyes locked on the waitress, his presence as overwhelming as ever. Despite the gravity of his power, something in the air had shifted, something subtle but undeniable. He stood before her now, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off his body. His voice, when he spoke, was low but deliberate. "You will stay here tonight. My son needs you." His words were not a request but an order, and yet, for the first time in her life, she didn't feel the crushing weight of fear. There was something about the way he said it, something softer hidden beneath the cold exterior. She looked at him, her heart racing. Her mind screamed for logic, for reason, but her instincts pushed her forward. She had come this far, why stop now? "But, why me?" she asked, her voice trembling, unsure of what to think. The vampire king's gaze softened ever so slightly, a change so subtle that it could easily have been overlooked. "Because you are the first to see him for who he is. Not just a prince, not just a burden to be carried. You saw the child in need, and you gave him comfort when no one else would." The waitress felt her breath catch in her throat. The weight of his words settled around her like a heavy cloak. She had simply acted out of kindness, out of a deep empathy for a child who had been overlooked and left to suffer in silence. But it seemed that in doing so, she had unwittingly crossed a line, one that would pull her deeper into the world of the vampire king. I didn't know who he was," she admitted softly. "I only saw a child, crying in pain. I couldn't ignore it." The vampire king watched her closely, his expression unreadable. He said nothing for a long moment, but the tension in the air thickened. His voice broke the silence, cold and commanding. "You will stay here. You will take care of him. That is your duty now." The room felt smaller, as if the walls themselves were closing in around her. She could sense the weight of his authority, the ancient power that clung to him like a second skin. Yet, she could also feel something else, something she couldn't quite place, a flicker of humanity hidden beneath the surface. But was that enough to trust him? Trust them? She swallowed hard, forcing herself to nod. "I will stay." The words were spoken out of obligation, but in truth, a part of her had already made the decision. She couldn't turn back now, not when the child, his son, was still clinging to her like his last lifeline. The vampire king gave a small nod, seemingly satisfied with her response. "Good. You will stay in the guest chambers. Rest. Tomorrow, we will begin the arrangements." The waitress nodded again, her mind still reeling from the events of the night. What was she getting herself into? She didn't know, but she knew one thing for sure. Nothing in her life would ever be the same again. The vampire king turned away, his cloak swirling around him as he made his way toward the far side of the room. His son, still in her arms, had fallen into a peaceful sleep, his face no longer marked by tears but relaxed, as if he had found the safety he so desperately needed. The waitress looked down at the boy, her heart swelling with a mixture of emotions. She had no idea what tomorrow would bring, what the future would hold. But for now, all she could do was hold the child close and pray that she could be the protector he needed. The vampire king's footsteps faded into the distance, and she was left alone with the sleeping child, surrounded by the looming shadows of the castle. What had begun as a simple act of kindness had now woven her into a world of power, danger, and secrets. As the night deepened, she found herself lost in the stillness, her mind spinning with questions and possibilities. But for now, she would protect this child. Tomorrow, everything else would come. The guest chambers were unlike anything the waitress had ever seen. The walls were adorned with intricate tapestries, the soft glow of candlelight reflecting off the polished stone floors. The bed, draped in rich velvet, was more magnificent than any she had ever imagined. But despite the opulence surrounding her, the only thing that mattered to her now was the boy in her arms, still sleeping peacefully. His small body, once trembling with fear and pain, now seemed relaxed, as if her presence had become a shield against the world. She gently placed him on the bed, pulling the thick covers over him to ensure he was warm. Her heart ached as she looked at him. She couldn't help but wonder what had happened to him, why he was so vulnerable, and why no one else had shown him the same compassion she had. Her thoughts were interrupted as the door opened slowly, and the Vampire King entered the room. His imposing figure filled the doorway, the shadows from the flickering candles dancing across his face, giving him an almost ethereal quality. He stepped inside, his eyes locking on her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. She stood up quickly, unsure of what to say or do. "Is he okay?" His voice, though deep and commanding, held a note of something she couldn't quite place. Concern? Worry? It was difficult to read his expression, but there was no mistaking the way he watched his son with a mixture of hope and fear. "He's resting," she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He seems better." The Vampire King nodded, though his gaze never left his son. For a long moment, there was silence between them, an unspoken tension hanging in the air. He looked at the boy, his expression softening just a little, before turning his gaze back to the waitress. "You did well tonight," he said, his voice low but firm. "You've given him something none of us could." The words were simple, but they struck her like a lightning bolt. She had simply done what any person with a heart would do, but hearing him say it, seeing the appreciation in his eyes, made her feel something she hadn't expected. Something more than just the weight of duty. I couldn't ignore it," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He's just a child." The Vampire King's expression shifted, something unreadable passing through his eyes. He took a step closer to her, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the room. "And you did what none of us dared. You saw him as a person, not as a symbol, not as a piece of a larger game. That is something I cannot ignore." His words were heavy, and for the first time, she could sense the weight of the life he led, the sacrifices, the burdens, the endless responsibilities. "He is my son," the Vampire King continued, his voice quieter now, as though speaking to himself as much as to her. "And yet, I have failed him. I could not give him what he needed, what he craved. I have surrounded him with power, with wealth, with protection, but never with what truly matters." He paused, his gaze fixed on the boy, who was now deep in sleep. "He needed love, and you gave him that." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, it was as if the entire world outside the castle had ceased to exist. The waitress stood in silence, absorbing the weight of his admission. She had only seen a child in need, but the Vampire King saw something much deeper in her act of kindness. Something that had been missing for far too long. She wasn't sure what to say. The moment felt surreal, as if the very foundation of her world had shifted. She had come here with nothing but a job to do, and now, she had become entangled in something much larger than herself. "I'm just a waitress," she said softly, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I don't know how to help him. I don't know how to help you." The Vampire King's eyes softened, a brief flicker of understanding crossing his face. He took another step closer to her, his presence overwhelming yet strangely comforting. "You don't need to know how to fix everything," he said, his voice gentle for the first time. "All you need to do is be here. For him. For both of us." She felt her breath catch in her throat, her heart racing. His words, simple and sincere, sent a rush of warmth through her chest. She had never imagined herself in this position, never thought she would be the one to offer comfort to someone so powerful, someone so distant from the world she knew. But now, standing before him, it felt like the only thing that mattered was the child in the bed, the boy who had found solace in her arms. The Vampire King nodded once, his gaze never leaving her. "You will stay with him," he said, more in order than a request. "You will be his protector, his anchor. And in doing so, you will also protect what little humanity remains in this castle." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, the waitress realized that her life had changed forever. She had entered this world as an outsider, a mere servant, but now she was a part of something much bigger, something far more dangerous. And no matter how much she tried to deny it, she knew that she would not, could not, walk away from it. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I will stay." And just like that, her fate was sealed. The days following the night the waitress agreed to stay were filled with a quiet tension, one that neither she nor the Vampire King fully understood. She had taken up residence in the guest chambers, now responsible for the care of the boy, who had become more than just a child in need of comfort. He had become the center of a complex, shifting world that no one could have anticipated. His small hands would reach for her at night, pulling her closer when the nightmares came. His cries were soft, but they pierced her heart each time. And every night, she would whisper words of comfort, promising him that he was safe. As the days passed, the bond between them grew. The Vampire King's son began to smile more often, his laughter a rare but beautiful sound in the cold halls of the castle. But with each passing day, the weight of the situation began to settle more heavily on the waitress. She had never imagined she would be placed in this position, to be the protector of a child, especially one who was bound by such dark power. She was just a woman who had been thrust into a world she did not understand, and yet, she could not turn away. The Vampire King, for his part, seemed to observe from a distance. His presence was constant, like the cold shadow of a towering mountain that was always looming. He would visit them, standing in the doorway, watching as she soothed his son. He never spoke much, but his eyes never left her, as if he were studying her, testing her in ways she couldn't comprehend. One afternoon, as the sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the stone floors, the Vampire King entered the room. The boy was playing with a wooden toy, his laughter filling the space, but when he saw his father, the joy seemed to fade, and he clung to the waitress's side. The Vampire King's face softened for a moment, but it was fleeting. "He's growing attached to you," the Vampire King said, his voice low, tinged with something that might have been regret or perhaps guilt. The waitress glanced at the boy, who was now hiding behind her, peeking out from the safety of her presence. "He needs someone," she replied softly. "He's just a child." The Vampire King said nothing at first, his gaze lingering on his son. "I know," he finally murmured. "That is why I brought you here." His words were heavy, carrying an undertone of something darker. She frowned, unsure of what he meant. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. The Vampire King took a step closer, his eyes never leaving her. "I brought you here to protect him," he said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "I cannot be the one to do it. I am not the one he needs." The words seemed to hang in the air, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. The waitress felt a chill run down her spine. I'm not equipped for this," she stammered, looking at the boy, who was now holding on to her, as if he were afraid the world might fall apart again. "I'm just a servant." The Vampire King's gaze softened, just slightly, but enough for her to see the flicker of something she hadn't expected: vulnerability. "You are more than that," he said quietly. "And you are more than just a caretaker. He needs you, and I need you." His words were raw, an admission of something she hadn't anticipated. She had known there was something different about this situation, but the reality of it was beginning to settle in. She was caught in a world of ancient power, dark secrets, and emotions that were beyond her understanding. She could see the burden in the Vampire King's eyes, the weight of centuries of responsibility that had taken its toll on him. But she also saw something else, the vulnerability of a father who, despite his power, could not offer what his son truly needed. It was a truth that weighed heavily on both of them. "I don't know if I can help him," she whispered, the words heavy with doubt. "I don't know if I can be what he needs." The Vampire King stepped closer, his voice steady. "You are already doing more than anyone else has. You've shown him kindness when no one else would. That is more than enough." The waitress felt the full weight of his words, and in that moment, something within her shifted. She had entered this world out of duty, but now, it was something else, something deeper. She had become a part of their lives, whether she wanted to or not. The boy, sensing the tension in the air, looked up at her, his eyes wide with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice small but filled with a sincerity that broke her heart. She knelt down beside him, her hands gently cupping his face. "I'm fine," she whispered, offering him a reassuring smile. "I'll always be here for you." The boy smiled, his small hands reaching for hers, and in that moment, she realized that she couldn't turn away. No matter how daunting the task, no matter how dangerous the world around them was, she had a responsibility now, not just to the boy, but to herself. The Vampire King watched them for a moment longer, before turning away, his eyes lingering on them for the briefest of moments. "Keep him safe," he said, his voice colder now, but there was a hint of something else in it, something like gratitude. The waitress nodded, a sense of resolve settling over her. I will. And as the vampire king left the room, she knew that her life had changed forever. She was no longer just a waitress. She was something more now, something bound to a fate that she could not escape. And with that realization came the certainty that no matter what happened next, she would protect the boy, his father, and the world they were all tangled in. Days passed, and the quiet tension in the castle only seemed to grow. The vampire king's son, who had been so fragile when she first met him, was slowly becoming a different child. He smiled more often, his laughter a rare but beautiful sound that now echoed through the halls. Yet, despite his newfound sense of comfort, the waitress felt a weight on her heart she couldn't shake. She was becoming deeply entangled in their world, his world, one that was far beyond anything she had ever known. She had never imagined she would play such a pivotal role in the life of a prince, let alone a vampire king. She found herself spending hours with the boy, teaching him simple things, how to draw, how to speak about his feelings, how to play games she had learned as a child. They spent time together every day, and in those quiet moments, she realized that she was no longer just a servant, but something more, something she hadn't asked to be, but had grown into. As the days went on, the vampire king seemed to retreat further into the shadows. He appeared only in passing, his presence always looming but distant. He would occasionally stop by to see his son, his gaze intense as he observed the bond between the waitress and the boy. He never said much, but his silence spoke volumes. She began to notice the subtle change in him, the way he seemed to watch her with increasing interest, as if testing her, measuring her every action. She couldn't help but feel that the vampire king was waiting for something, waiting to see if she could truly protect his son, waiting to see if she could fill the role he could never fully occupy. But she wasn't sure she was equipped for it. She wasn't trained in court politics, or the dark arts, or the manipulative games the vampires seemed to play. She had only her instinct, and that was enough for her to stay by the boy's side. One evening, as the sun began to set behind the tall, towering windows of the castle, the vampire king entered her chambers without warning. His presence was almost overwhelming, like the storm clouds rolling in before a downpour. The boy, now sitting at the table, glanced up nervously, but the vampire king didn't look at him. His attention was fixed solely on the waitress. "You've been good for him," the vampire king said, his voice low and measured. "But I need to know something." The waitress turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you need to know?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease gnawing at her insides. "Can you protect him?" The vampire king's question hung heavy in the air, and she felt the weight of it, like a mountain pressing down on her chest. Could she protect him? She didn't know. She had never been part of their world before. She wasn't sure she had the strength to keep the boy safe, not from the dark forces that hovered around the edges of their lives. She only knew one thing. She couldn't let him down. "I'll try," she whispered. The vampire king studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. He took a step closer, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "Trying is not enough," he said coldly. "You must succeed." She swallowed hard, feeling the pressure mounting, but she didn't back down. "I won't let anything happen to him." For the first time, the vampire king's gaze softened just slightly. He studied her, as if weighing her every word, every emotion she projected. "Good," he said, turning his gaze away from her and towards the boy, who was still watching from the corner of the room. "Because if you fail, it won't just be him who suffers." The threat hung in the air, but it was not a threat of death or punishment. It was something more subtle, more dangerous, a promise that if she failed, she would be pulled into something much darker, something far more dangerous than she could imagine. The boy, sensing the change in the air, stood up and walked toward the vampire king. He reached out a trembling hand, his small fingers brushing against the king's sleeve. "Papa," the boy whispered, his voice soft and unsure. The vampire king paused, his gaze shifting to his son. For a moment, the king's cold exterior cracked, and she saw something she had not expected: vulnerability. He looked down at the boy, his expression softening. "You should rest, my son," he said quietly, his voice laced with an unfamiliar tenderness. The boy nodded, his face lighting up with a small, genuine smile. As he turned to leave the room, The Vampire King's gaze shifted back to the waitress. He didn't say anything, but there was a look in his eyes, a look that said everything. She was now part of something much bigger than she could have imagined. The weight of the responsibility she had taken on settled heavily on her shoulders, but she couldn't let it overwhelm her. Not now. Not when the boy needed her. Do not fail him. The Vampire King's voice echoed in her mind as he left the room. The words lingered long after he had gone. But the waitress knew she would never fail him. Not if it meant protecting the child who had become the light in the dark world she had entered. No matter what came next, she would keep him safe, no matter the cost. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty and a creeping sense of dread. The weight of the Vampire King's words still hung in the air like a dark cloud, threatening to suffocate her at any moment. She had sworn to protect the boy, but the task ahead of her seemed impossible. She wasn't just caring for a child now. She was guarding the heir to a powerful, ancient kingdom, a kingdom built on blood and secrets. And with every passing day, she could feel the invisible forces that lurked around them, just out of sight, watching, waiting. The boy, despite his newfound joy and comfort, remained haunted by nightmares. His cries at night were softer now, but they still echoed through the chambers, a constant reminder of the trauma he had endured. She would hold him close, whispering soothing words, but every time he woke, there was a flicker of fear in his eyes. He wasn't just afraid of the dark. He was afraid of something much deeper. And every time she comforted him, she could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the trust he had placed in her. It was a trust she couldn't betray, not now, not when he needed her the most. One evening, as the moonlight streamed through the tall, arched windows of the guest chambers, she found herself staring out at the vast, unending landscape beyond the castle walls. The world outside seemed so far away, so distant, and yet the danger was so close. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of soft footsteps behind her. She turned to find the Vampire King standing in the doorway, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity she had grown accustomed to. He had not spoken to her in days, and his presence now, silent yet overwhelming, made her heart race. Is he asleep? The Vampire King's voice was low, almost a whisper, as if he didn't want to disturb the fragile peace that had settled over the boy. Yes, she replied, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. He's finally resting. The Vampire King nodded but did not move. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence between them, a silence that spoke volumes. He seemed to be studying her, as if searching for something she couldn't see. Finally, he spoke again, his voice softer this time, carrying a weight of unspoken thoughts. You've done well. His words surprised her. She hadn't expected praise, not from him, and certainly not for something as simple as keeping his son safe. I'm just doing what I promised, she said quietly. The Vampire King took a step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. No, he said, his voice firm yet gentle. You've done more than just keep him safe. You've given him something no one else has, something I could never give him. You've given him love, and that is something no one else has been able to offer. The words struck her like a bolt of lightning. She had always thought of herself as nothing more than a caretaker, a simple servant doing her duty. But in that moment, she realized that she had become something much more. She had become a mother figure to the boy, someone he could trust, someone who could offer him the comfort and safety he had been denied for so long. The realization sent a wave of emotion crashing over her, and for a brief moment, she felt completely overwhelmed by the weight of her responsibilities. The Vampire King seemed to sense her inner turmoil. He stepped closer, his presence filling the room, but his gaze was not filled with the usual coldness. There was something softer, something almost human in his eyes. You've earned my trust, he said, his voice quieter now, almost as if he were speaking to himself. And my son's trust. But you must understand, this world is not kind to those who show weakness. If you are to protect him, you must be strong, stronger than you've ever been before. She nodded, though she wasn't sure if she believed him. Could she be strong enough? Could she protect the boy from the dangers that lurked beyond the walls of the castle? She didn't know, but she would try. She had to. I'll do whatever it takes, she whispered, her voice filled with determination. The Vampire King studied her for a long moment, as if weighing her words. Then, without a word, he turned and left the room, his cloak swirling behind him like the shadows that seemed to follow him wherever he went. The door clicked shut behind him, and the silence returned. But this time, the silence was different. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the absence of fear, the absence of uncertainty. For the first time since she had entered this world, she felt a sense of resolve settling within her. She had a purpose now, a reason to fight, and she would protect the boy, no matter what. As she turned to look at the sleeping child, a sense of peace washed over her. He was safe for now, but she knew that this peace was fragile, that it wouldn't last forever. The Vampire King's world was one of darkness and danger, a world where survival meant more than just physical strength. But she wasn't afraid. She had made a promise, and she would keep it, no matter the cost. The days turned into weeks, and the weight of the promise she had made began to settle into her bones like an unshakable truth. The boy, despite the tender care she provided, still carried a deep sadness, a grief she couldn't fully understand. His nightmares continued, his small body trembling. In her arms as he awoke in terror, eyes wide with fear. The world he had been born into was not one of comfort, and even though she had become a source of solace for him, the darkness still clung to him like a shadow. It was not just the boy she worried about. The Vampire King's presence, though often distant, was always felt. He appeared less frequently now, only checking in on his son when necessary, his cold demeanor never wavering. She could feel his eyes on her, watching from the shadows, studying her actions. Every move she made was scrutinized, measured against an unseen scale. She had earned his trust, but she also knew the price of failure. He had warned her, his words clear in her mind. You must be stronger than you've ever been before. But how could she protect the boy from a world that was so much bigger and more dangerous than anything she had ever known? The castle, despite its grandeur, felt like a cage, beautiful, yes, but suffocating. And outside, the world of vampires and power games lurked, waiting for any weakness to exploit. One evening, the boy was playing with his toys in the corner of the room, his face bright with the simple joy of a child who had known little of happiness. The sight filled the waitress with both love and sorrow. She had never asked for this responsibility, but now she couldn't imagine her life without it. The door opened quietly, and the Vampire King stepped into the room. His eyes immediately fell on his son, watching the boy for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, as if sensing her gaze, he turned to her. He's growing stronger, he said, his voice a mix of approval and something deeper, something more complex. But he still carries the weight of his past. The waitress nodded, unsure of what to say. The king's words echoed in her mind. The weight of his past. What did that truly mean for the boy? What had he endured before she came into his life? And more importantly, what had the Vampire King done, or failed to do, to protect his son from it? I see it in his eyes, the Vampire King continued, his gaze softening, if only for a moment. He is not like other children. He cannot be. The world we live in demands something different from him. She felt a pang of sorrow for the boy, but she also felt a deeper resolve. I will protect him, she said, her voice steady, though her heart raced. I'll do whatever it takes. The Vampire King studied her for a long moment, and for the first time, she thought she saw a flicker of something else in his eyes, something human. You've already done more than you know, he replied, his voice quieter now. More than I ever could. There was a long silence between them, and the waitress wondered if the Vampire King was speaking to her or to himself. You think you are the only one who cares for him, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. But you don't know the burden I carry as his father. I cannot be what he needs. And I fear that, in time, you will not be either. His words struck her hard. She had known that this task would not be easy, but she had never imagined that the Vampire King, so powerful, so cold, would doubt her. She stepped forward, her resolve hardening. I don't need to be what you are, she said softly. I just need to be what he needs. A mother, someone to show him that love can still exist in this world. The Vampire King did not reply immediately, his gaze turning back to the boy, who was now looking up at them with innocent curiosity. You will have to be more than that, he said after a long pause. The world he is destined to rule will not be kind. You must prepare him for what lies ahead. You must teach him strength, just as I have. And you must protect him from those who would seek to use him. The weight of his words settled heavily on her shoulders. She had come here as a mere servant, someone thrust into the middle of a world she had never asked for. But now she understood. She was not just a caretaker. She was a protector, a teacher, a mother figure to a child who was destined for a life far beyond the safety of these walls. The Vampire King's eyes lingered on her, and for the briefest of moments, she saw something softer in his gaze. "You're right," he said quietly. "I cannot do this alone." She nodded, feeling the heavy responsibility settle deep within her. "I won't let him down," she said, her voice firm, though the fear in her chest threatened to choke her. The Vampire King gave a single nod and turned to leave the room, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. The boy looked up at her, his small face filled with trust. "Will you stay with me?" he asked, his voice soft and uncertain. She knelt beside him, taking his small hand in hers. "I'll stay," she whispered. "Always." As the boy smiled, the weight of the world seemed to fade away, if only for a moment. She knew that the path ahead would not be easy, but she also knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would protect this child, no matter the cost. The castle had never felt so cold. Despite the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth, despite the golden lights streaming through the windows, a chill seemed to linger in the air, one that could not be dispelled. The weight of the Vampire King's words from the night before haunted her. He had admitted his own shortcomings, his inability to be the father his son needed, but those words, though soft, still carried an undeniable truth. She wasn't just a caretaker anymore. She had become the boy's anchor, the one thing that kept him tethered to any semblance of normalcy in a world built on darkness. The boy, now more confident and at ease, had begun to trust her completely. He no longer hid behind her when the Vampire King entered the room. Instead, he smiled up at his father, a smile that seemed to carry the weight of both hope and fear. Every time the boy's laughter filled the chambers, the waitress couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. She had seen the shadows in his eyes, the things he hadn't said, the things he couldn't. The boy was no ordinary child. His heritage, his lineage, would eventually claim him, no matter how much she wished it didn't. Her thoughts were interrupted as the door to the chamber creaked open, and the Vampire King stepped inside, his presence filling the room in a way that made everything else seem to fade into the background. His gaze immediately found the boy, watching him with an intensity that made the air thick with unspoken tension. "How is he today?" the Vampire King asked, his voice as cold and detached as ever, yet there was something in his tone, something that suggested a deeper care, a deeper concern than he let on. The waitress stood up, smoothing her simple dress, feeling the weight of his gaze. "He's better," she replied softly, her voice steady despite the unease swirling inside her. "He's still struggling with the nightmares, but he's more at peace than he was." The Vampire King's eyes flickered to the boy, who was now sitting on the floor, playing with a small wooden horse. His smile faded slightly, a brief flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "I see," he murmured, almost to himself. He stepped further into the room, and the boy looked up at him, his bright eyes shining with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. The Vampire King knelt down beside him, his gaze softening, if only for a moment. "You've been brave," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. "But you will have to be even braver in the days to come. The world we live in is not kind to those who are weak. You will need to be strong." The boy nodded slowly, but the fear in his eyes remained. The waitress could see it. She knew what the boy had yet to say, the deep, hidden fear that clung to him like a second skin, the fear of his destiny, the fear of the power that coursed through his veins. The Vampire King looked at her then, his gaze turning colder, harder. "He must be prepared," he said, his voice sharper now. "I cannot afford to be weak, and neither can he." She nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. "I will do everything I can to help him," she replied, her voice firm, though her heart was racing. The Vampire King stood, his dark cloak swirling around him like a shadow. He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he paused. His back was to her, but she could feel his presence, the weight of it bearing down on her. "I hope you understand," he said quietly, his voice almost imperceptible. "What you're protecting is not just a child. He is the future of our world. And that world is not a kind one." The words hung in the air like an ominous warning. She could hear the weight behind them. The centuries of pain, of loss, of decisions that had shaped the vampire king into who he was. He had tried to protect his son, but in the end, it had been her, an ordinary human woman, who had stepped into the role he could not fully take on. The door closed behind him, and the silence that followed was heavy. The boy, still sitting on the floor, looked up at her with wide eyes, sensing the shift in the air. She crossed the room to him, kneeling down beside him. "You're going to be all right," she said softly, her voice full of conviction. "I won't let anything happen to you." He smiled up at her, the fear in his eyes slowly fading, replaced by a trust so deep it almost broke her heart. But even as she reassured him, a part of her knew the truth. She couldn't protect him from everything. She couldn't shield him from the darkness that was bound to come, the darkness of his heritage, of his father's world. All she could do was love him, guide him, and be there when the world tried to tear him apart. As the boy drifted back into his play, the waitress sat back, her heart heavy but determined. She knew now that her purpose was clear. No matter the cost, no matter the danger, she would protect him. She would be the light in his world of darkness, the one thing that could never be taken from him. And when the time came for him to face the weight of his destiny, she would be there to help him carry it. The following days grew increasingly tense as the castle's halls seemed to close in around her. The boy, though more at ease, still carried an invisible weight that hung over him like a storm cloud. She could feel it every time he looked at her. Those fleeting moments when his gaze held more than just childlike wonder. Moments when he would look at her with the knowledge of something dark that he wasn't old enough to understand yet. But she couldn't let herself dwell on that. Not now. Not when she had made a promise, not only to him, but to herself. The boy had started to open up more during their time together, talking about his fears, his questions about his past, and the way the shadows seemed to haunt him at night. Sometimes, when they sat together, he would ask about his mother. His voice was so small, so unsure, it broke her heart each time. She didn't know much about his mother, only that she had died when he was young, leaving the boy to grow up in a world of power struggles, far away from the warmth a mother could offer. She could never replace the mother he had lost, but she could offer something: comfort, stability, a small piece of peace in a world that had given him nothing but chaos. But the weight of her duty was beginning to grow heavier. The more she spent time with him, the more she realized the depth of the responsibility she had taken on. The vampire king, though distant, continued to watch them both closely. He had become more of a presence in the castle again, his steps echoing through the halls, his gaze ever sharp, though he rarely spoke. When he did, his words were always measured, careful, as if waiting for something. She wasn't sure what it was that he expected from her, if it was some deeper level of loyalty, some unspoken test that would prove her worth. She had already proved that she could protect his son, that much was clear. But could she prove that she could handle the truth of what his son was meant to become? One evening, the vampire king summoned her to the council room, a place she had never entered. Her heart raced as she stood outside the tall, iron doors, feeling the weight of the impending conversation. She had no idea what was about to unfold, but she knew it would change everything. The moment she entered, the coldness of the room hit her like a wave. The long, dark table stretched before her, and seated at it were several members of the vampire king's inner circle, their eyes watching her with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. The vampire king sat at the head of the table, his eyes locked onto hers with the familiar intensity that never seemed to fade. "You've done well so far," he began, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of something darker. "But the time is coming when he will need more than just your protection." She felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The vampire king stood slowly, his dark cloak sweeping behind him as he moved around the table. "He is the heir to a legacy far greater than you can understand," he said, his words cold but unyielding. "And as his protector, you must understand what that means. His future is not just about safety. It's about power, control, and it's about surviving a world that will not hesitate to tear him apart if he shows weakness." The words hung in the air, heavy with the gravity of the reality she had already begun to glimpse. She had known that the boy was not just an ordinary child, that he was the son of the vampire king, but hearing the truth spoken so plainly made it all the more real. The boy was not just a child. He was the future of a kingdom built on blood, power, and secrets. And she was the one tasked with ensuring he would survive it. "I will do whatever it takes," she said, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her chest. The Vampire King stopped in front of her, his piercing gaze never leaving her face. "You will have to be more than just a caretaker," he warned. "You will have to teach him, train him, and prepare him for the day when he must take his place among us. He will need strength not just of the body, but of the mind and spirit. And if you cannot give him that, then you will fail him. And you will fail me." The weight of his words sank in, settling deep into her bones. She was not just a protector. She was a teacher, a guide, a force in his life that would shape the future of the kingdom. The boy's future was now bound to her, and with it, the entire fate of the vampire world. She didn't know if she was strong enough for that, but she knew she couldn't back away now. She had already made the promise, and she intended to keep it. The Vampire King's eyes softened, just barely, and for a brief moment, she saw something else in him. Something human, something vulnerable. He nodded once and turned away, his cloak swirling around him. "I hope you understand the gravity of what lies ahead," he said, his voice softer now. She nodded, though. She didn't know if she truly did understand. She had no idea what was coming, but she knew she couldn't stop it. "I'll protect him," she said, her voice firm. "No matter what." The Vampire King paused before leaving the room, his eyes briefly meeting hers. "Then you will do what no one else could," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "You will save him from a fate worse than death." With that, he left, and the silence in the room settled over her like a heavy blanket. She had no choice but to follow through. The boy's future, the future of the kingdom, and her own fate were now all intertwined. And there was no turning back. The days after the Vampire King's words had left a permanent mark on her. The weight of what he had said still lingered in the air like a heavy fog, and the responsibilities that she had taken on now felt like chains wrapping tighter around her. The boy, though still a child, was no longer the fragile, frightened figure he had been. He had grown stronger, more confident, but there was still a sense of something lost within him, something he could not express. She knew the Vampire King was right. He needed more than protection, more than affection. He needed to be prepared for the world that was waiting for him, a world that would demand more than he could give if he wasn't ready. The girl found herself caught between the boy's innocence and the cold, hard truth of his future. There were days when she wondered if she was the right person to prepare him for the life that awaited him. She was still just a servant, after all, not someone trained in the ways of power, deception, or ancient traditions. She had no idea what it meant to rule, what it took to command respect and fear. But as she spent more time with him, she realized she had something far more powerful to offer than just knowledge or strength. She had the one thing the boy desperately needed: love. She had become a mother to him in the truest sense of the word, though she was not his birth mother. And with that came a deep, unshakable bond. But as days passed, the Vampire King began to increase the frequency of his visits. His presence in the castle grew more commanding, and his eyes, sharp as ever, seemed to watch her every move, studying her with an intensity that made her stomach twist with unease. He never asked about her training, her ability to teach his son the ways of their world. He only asked about the boy's progress, the boy's growth. He watched, and he waited, as if he were waiting for something to break, something to prove that she wasn't enough. One evening, after a long day spent trying to ease the boy's fears, she found herself summoned to the Vampire King's private study. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of ancient tomes and power. The king sat behind a massive wooden desk, his eyes focused on some unreadable document before him. When she entered, his eyes flickered up to meet hers, piercing and cold. "You've been working with him," he said, his voice low, like a predator circling its prey. "But there is more to training him than mere affection. You know this, don't you?" She nodded, though her throat tightened with nerves. "Yes, Your Majesty. I'm doing everything I can to help him." The Vampire King's gaze darkened. "Everything," he repeated, his voice dripping with a certain bitterness. "Do you really think that your love will be enough? Do you think that your tenderness will prepare him for the world he will inherit?" She took a deep breath, standing her ground. "I believe love is what he needs most right now, but I know I can't protect him from everything. I'm doing my best to teach him, to help him grow strong. The Vampire King's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no warmth in it. Strength alone is not enough, he said. Your best will not be enough. He is my son, and he is destined for a throne that will not show him mercy. He will need to learn to be ruthless, to use his power, to command others. He must be prepared to face the challenges that will come for him, challenges I cannot shelter him from any longer. Her heart sank. What do you want me to do? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Vampire King stood, moving toward the window. You will begin his training, he said simply. Not just in combat, not just in the ways of power, but in the true nature of our world, its cruelty, its treachery, its darkness. He must learn what it takes to survive in a world where mercy is a weakness and strength is the only currency. His voice grew colder, more distant, as he continued. And you will be the one to teach him. The words hit her like a physical blow. She had already given so much of herself to the boy, had already poured so much love and care into him. But now she was being asked to strip him of his innocence, to teach him the very things that had always terrified her about this world. I can't, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. I can't take away what he is, what he could be. The Vampire King turned to face her, his gaze steady and unyielding. You can and you will. Because if you don't, you will fail him. You will fail me. And when the time comes, he will be unprepared, and the world will consume him. His eyes narrowed. I will not let that happen. She swallowed hard, feeling her world begin to unravel. The boy, the child she had sworn to protect, was not the innocent soul she had once thought him to be. His future was already written in the blood of the powerful, and she was being asked to prepare him for it, no matter the cost. She nodded slowly, a cold realization settling in her chest. I understand, she whispered. The Vampire King's gaze softened just slightly, a fleeting moment of something that might have been approval. Good, he said. Then begin his training. You will make sure he is ready. As he turned to leave, the weight of his words still pressed heavily on her. She had no choice now. She had made a promise, and she would keep it. She would prepare the boy, no matter the cost, no matter the consequences. She would teach him the ways of the world, its darkness, its power, and its cruelty, because that was the only way he could survive it. The following days were filled with an overwhelming sense of tension. The waitress, now fully committed to her new role, spent her time preparing the boy for what lay ahead, though each lesson seemed to tear at her heart. She had promised to protect him, to help him grow strong, but what she had not anticipated was how quickly she would have to strip away his innocence. His smile, which once came so easily, now seemed a distant memory. The boy had begun to ask questions, difficult, painful questions. He asked about his mother, about the world outside the castle walls, about the power he was destined to inherit. But the hardest question came one evening, when he looked up at her with wide, innocent eyes and asked, Am I a monster? The question hung in the air, and she felt the world shift beneath her feet. She had always known the boy was destined for greatness, but greatness in their world meant cruelty, manipulation, and power. It meant being a force that would be used to control others. She took a deep breath, swallowing the lump that had formed in her throat. No, she whispered softly, crouching beside him. You are not a monster. But there will be times when the world will try to make you one. His small fingers curled into the fabric of her dress, the fear in his eyes making her heart ache. I don't want to be like them, he said, his voice trembling. I don't want to hurt people. She pulled him close, holding him tightly. You don't have to be like them, she said, her voice firm. You are not them. You can choose a different path. But even as she said the words, she knew the truth. The world he was born into was not one that allowed for choices. His bloodline would pull him toward power, and with power came enemies, people who would stop at nothing to use him, to break him, to make him a weapon. And that was the lesson she would have to teach him. Over the next few weeks, the training began. Every day, the boy was taught more about the world he was born into, its rules, its dangers, and its dark power. She began teaching him the art of control, of reading people, of knowing when to fight and when to yield. She showed him how to mask his emotions, how to use his charm as a weapon, and how to listen for the lies others told him. It was not the kind of training she had ever imagined giving. But she was determined to make him strong, to prepare him for the ruthless world ahead. The Vampire King watched. their sessions from a distance, his presence always looming in the background. He said little, but she knew he was judging her, weighing whether she was truly capable of preparing his son for the future. She could feel his eyes on her whenever she spoke to the boy, whenever she showed him something new. He never expressed approval, but she saw the slight nods, the brief moments when his gaze softened just a fraction. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her going. One evening, after a particularly grueling lesson on manipulation and power, the boy collapsed on the floor, exhausted. He had grown stronger, his muscles more defined, but his spirit seemed to shrink with each lesson. The weight of what he was learning was beginning to crush him. She knelt beside him, brushing the hair out of his eyes. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice gentle. He nodded, though his eyes betrayed the truth. "I'm tired," he said softly. "I don't want to be this way." Her heart broke for him. "You don't have to be," she said, taking his hand in hers. "But you have to be strong, for yourself, for your future." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with doubt. "Will I ever be happy again?" he asked. The question cut through her like a blade. She wanted to tell him that he could be happy, that he could live a life of peace and love, but she knew that was a lie. His destiny was written in a language of power and control, not peace and love. "I don't know," she whispered. "But you can still find moments of happiness. You can still make choices that matter." He nodded, though she could see the uncertainty in his gaze. She held him close, trying to push away the growing sense of hopelessness that threatened to overwhelm her. She had promised to protect him, but could she protect him from the world itself? She couldn't change the path that had been set for him, but she could fight to make sure he would not lose himself in the process. Over the next few weeks, their lessons became more intense, more focused on the harsh realities of the world he was about to inherit. She showed him how to stand firm, how to command a room, how to use his power to bend others to his will. It was the kind of training that she had feared would harden him, would take away the last remnants of his innocence. And yet, despite the fear and the sadness she felt, she couldn't stop. He needed this. The world needed him to be ready. One evening, as they sat together after another long day of training, the boy looked up at her, his expression serious for the first time in weeks. "Will I ever be like you?" he asked quietly. "Will I ever be able to care about people again?" She didn't know how to answer. She had seen the transformation in him, the way his eyes had hardened, the way his heart had slowly begun to close off to the world. She had seen it in herself too. The world they lived in had a way of doing that. It took away the softness, the warmth, until all that was left was the cold, hard reality of power. She smiled, though it was a sad smile. "You are already like me," she said softly, "and you will always have the ability to care. But you have to be careful. The world will test you. It will push you to the brink. But if you hold on to that part of yourself, you will survive." He nodded, though the doubt still lingered in his eyes. She wished she could promise him more. She wished she could promise him that he would find happiness, that he would find peace. But all she could offer was the truth. The world was cruel, and they would have to fight every step of the way. And all she could do was make sure that, when the time came, he would be ready. The day arrived when the weight of everything finally became too much to bear. The boy had grown, his training making him sharper, stronger, and more aware of the world around him. But despite all the lessons, despite everything she had done to prepare him, the same doubt remained in his eyes, just as it had been from the start. He wasn't the child he had once been, and yet he wasn't the ruler he was destined to become either. It was a strange, unsettling balance that weighed heavily on her heart. She had tried to give him everything, knowledge, strength, and most importantly, the love that he so desperately needed. But now, even as he stood before her, poised and composed, she could see the truth in his eyes. He was a child of darkness, destined to be consumed by it, no matter how much light she tried to shine. The training had come to its peak. The vampire king, who had always stood back, now came forward to oversee the final phase of the boy's transformation. His cold, calculating gaze watched every movement, every word, every glance exchanged between them. There was no warmth left in him, no tenderness. He was the king, and the kingdom needed a ruler. And his son would be that ruler. The boy, now 15, stood tall and silent in front of the vampire king, his face unreadable, his posture straight. He had learned how to command, how to manipulate, and how to survive in the world that awaited him. The lessons had been brutal, the training relentless. She had seen the boy grow into a figure of strength, but it came at the cost of his innocence. What was left was a hardened shell, a person shaped by power and survival, not love. "It is time," the Vampire King spoke, his voice echoing through the vast, empty hall. The boy nodded silently. She had taught him everything she could, but now, it was his father who would guide him into the final stages of his transformation. She stepped back, watching as the Vampire King approached his son. For the first time, the boy didn't flinch, didn't look to her for reassurance. He was ready, or at least, that's what the king believed. The boy's gaze remained fixed on his father, unwavering. "You will learn to lead with strength," the Vampire King said, his voice commanding. "You will learn to command not just those who are beneath you, but those who are your equals as well. And when the time comes, you will take your place as the ruler of this kingdom." The boy's response was simple, but it carried the weight of a future too large for any child to bear. "I will," he said, his voice steady. It was then that the Vampire King turned to her, his gaze cold but firm. "You have done your part," he said. "The boy is ready for the next phase." There was no appreciation in his words, no thanks. Only acknowledgement of a job completed. She stood silently, her heart heavy with a mixture of pride and sadness. She had prepared him, but the cost had been more than she had imagined. The boy she had once held in her arms, the child who had trusted her, was now a prince, ready to take on the mantle of power, but at what cost? She had protected him, yes, but in doing so, she had given him something else, something no one should have to bear. The knowledge that he was a part of a world that would swallow him whole if he didn't learn to fight. "Thank you," the Vampire King said, his words as cold as ever, though there was something beneath them, perhaps respect, perhaps something else she couldn't quite place. But there was no time to consider it. The boy was standing now, his shoulders squared, his expression calm. He had become the prince his father had always wanted him to be. "Go," the Vampire King said, turning toward the door. "The boy will be ready for the trials ahead. You have prepared him as much as you can." She watched them leave, the king's imposing figure towering over his son, who followed obediently, his face a mask of calm. She had prepared him for this moment, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the boy she had once known was lost forever. He was no longer the frightened child who had clung to her for comfort, the one who had sought reassurance in her arms. Now, he was something else, a ruler in the making, a figure who would wield power over those weaker than him. And though she had loved him, though she had done everything she could to keep him safe, she couldn't help but wonder if it had been enough. Would he ever find peace in this world? Would he ever be able to embrace the light that had once been so strong in him? She couldn't know the answers. The world had already begun to change him, and there was no turning back now. But as she watched the doors close behind them, she whispered a prayer to herself, wishing for his happiness, wishing for his strength, wishing for his soul to survive the darkness that was sure to come. She had done all she could, and now it was his fight. The future was his to shape, and she could only hope that he would remember the lessons of love and humanity that she had tried so hard to instill in him. The world would test him, and she knew that he would face unimaginable challenges ahead. But no matter what, she would always remember the boy he had once been, and she would carry that memory with her forever. In this captivating tale, the journey of a young boy, heir to a powerful and ancient kingdom, unfolds in a dark world of power struggles and emotional turmoil. The story takes readers on a path filled with love, sacrifice, and the heavy burden of destiny. As the boy navigates his destiny, he is faced with the challenge of becoming a ruler in a world that demands strength, ruthlessness, and control. As the boy grows, so does the complexity of his relationships, especially with the woman who promises to protect him and prepare him for the darkness that lies ahead. In the process, the story weaves in themes of power, love, and the price of survival, making it a remarkable addition to vampire stories that blend the supernatural with the human heart. With each lesson the boy learns, he edges closer to embracing his fate, but it comes at the cost of his innocence and childhood. The Vampire King, cold and calculating, watches as his son is molded into the ruler he needs, while the protector struggles with the emotional toll of teaching him the harsh truths of the world. As the boy becomes more hardened, he finds himself trapped between the love he has received and the ruthless future he is destined to face. This emotional and complex story is a perfect addition to the world of vampire stories, showcasing the intense emotional battles and the intricate web of relationships within a supernatural setting. With themes of power, sacrifice, and inner conflict, this tale brings the reader deep into the heart of what it means to grow up in a world ruled by darkness and blood. The story's culmination challenges both the boy and his protector to face the ultimate test. Can love survive in a world so full of power struggles and shadowy forces? This captivating narrative is an unforgettable addition to vampire stories, offering a deep exploration of human emotion and the price of power.